we can go ahead and get started. So me and Audrey will be presenting today. We can just do quick introductions. I'm Kamaya. I use she, her pronouns. I organize with Washington Youth for Climate Justice for like a year and a half-ish. Yeah.
And I'm Audrey, and I work with the policy team at Washington Youth for Climate Justice. I've been here since like February. I don't remember.
Yeah, so we're going to be today continuing like our other workshops that we've been doing about racial justice and climate justice and how they're connected. So this workshop, as you guys know, since you signed up for it, is America's Hidden History, and it'll be about history of racial inequality, segregation, and oppression in this country since the 1950s and going through decades until present. Yeah, we can get started.
So in 2018, the Southern Poverty Law Center found that American students receive an incredibly inadequate education on the subject of slavery and segregation. 92% of students were unable to identify slavery as the primary cause of the Civil War, and 68% of students did not know that an amendment to the Constitution was necessary to abolish slavery. Additionally, 10% of teachers felt uncomfortable discussing slavery in the classroom. So nearly 4 million students graduate high school each year, and the vast majority of them are uneducated on the systems which have shaped our country for the past 400 years. We're teaching kids that the wrongs in the past do not bear on the present, or we are not teaching them the wrongs at all. This miseducation leads to a generation that is unable to see the workings of systemic racism and is therefore unable to change those systems. We can't be lulled into the American dream.
The truth is that our school education system completely fails to acknowledge the constant systemic oppression that built this country, continuing to uphold white supremacy all the way back from slavery up to this present day. Back in 1618, the first 20-plus enslaved people were brought to Jamestown, Virginia. And in 1636, the first American ship named Desire, built in Massachusetts, forced enslaved people from Africa to be brought to the United States of America. The next 3 ships built to enslave people were named Fortune, Hope, and Prosperity. These ships' names of words that portray positivity and aspiration for a great nation, yet terrorizes human beings being captured by white Americans. White supremacy is what this country is built from. And in 1662, Virginia passed a law that made children of enslaved mothers to be forced into slavery once they were born too, as white slave owners raped enslaved people, forcing enslaved women to have children who would also grow up to be tortured by the white man, who claimed that he owned these human beings and believed them to be slaves.
In 1667, white slave owners in Virginia were becoming concerned about the enslaved people becoming Christian, as the white slave owners thought that this would lead to the enslaved people demanding basic human rights. In response, white slave owners declared that enslaved people could not become Christian, and the only way to become Christian was by the charity and piety of their owners. In 1669, a white slave owner is legally allowed to murder an enslaved person. From 1689 all the way to 1865, more than 130 documents of legislation were signed and made to enforce the systemic oppression against Black people and block their basic human rights in the United States. In 1740, white slave owners possessed 58 chapters of slave code so that enslaved people would be kept in subjugation and obedience. In 1755, Georgia plantation owners and white people were told that they must join a militia that had the sole purpose to look over slaves and make sure that they did not plan to escape.
In 1776, 41 of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence owned human beings, enslaved people who were forced to work long hours with little rest and obey their white masters or else were punished. The Declaration of Independence signed for the human rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and yet Black people continue to be tortured and abused by their white slave owners, many of whom signed this document. In the Constitution, the founding document of the American government, it counts individual African slaves as only 3/5 of a person and prohibits them from seeking freedom. In 1790, Annual cotton production grew to 1.5 million pounds through the hard work of 700,000 Black people that picked cotton and yet received the worst of treatment from white slave owners who profited off Black people's labor, estimated to be 250 million hours worth total. The abuse, torture, unjust system that oppresses Black people in this country to then grow the wealth of white people is what has built the foundation of America's economy, an integral part of this country's move from an agrarian society to the world's leading industrial nation. But this racist institution was and still is protected from through the Constitution, federal and state law. Slave codes collectively prohibited slaves from moving freely, becoming legally married, getting an education, gathering for worship or leisure, and owning property. Additional laws gave legal authority to vigilante slave catchers and allowed masters to kill, maim, and rape their own slaves.
The Constitution, signed in 1787, only mentioned the word slavery once, and yet held many racist laws to systematically oppress Black and Indigenous people in this country. In Article 1, Section 2, it explains that Black people would be given 3/5 of their representation in government and 3/5 the amount of funds from tax money compared to a white person, stating representatives and direct taxes shall be a proportion among the several states which may be included within this union according to their prospective numbers, which shall be determined by adding the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. Article 1, Section 9 explains that capturing and forcing people onto ships based on the color of their skin in order to abuse them and to be slaves in the land of the United States of America is legal, stating that the migration or importation of such persons as the several states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by the legislature prior to the year 1808.
Legislation after legislation, Black people continued to be hampered of basic human rights. The Dred Scott decision of 1857 declared that no Black person could gain the privileges of citizenship because the Constitution was not written with the Black community in mind. With the push for abolition coinciding with this increase in suppression, tensions ran high and came to a head with the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. While Lincoln had explicitly not run on a platform of abolition, many slave states still feared he would weaken their rights to own slaves and, in retaliation, seceded from the Union.
The following year, the Confederacy was founded. Vice President Alexander Stephens gave a speech detailing why the 11 states seceded and what values their new government was based upon, that was to say, slavery. Our new government is founded upon the great truth that the is not equal to the white man. To this superior race is his natural and normal condition. An entire nation was founded on the racist belief that Black people are inferior to white people. People today fly flags honoring that nation.
The average yearly cotton production in the United States was 2.3 billion pounds, creating 60% of the U.S.'s exports through the hard work of Black people in this country. In 1863, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all enslaved people shall be free. However, we rarely learn about the Compensated Emancipation Act, signed in 1862, where in the District of Columbia, slaves were freed and the white slave owners were each paid $300 for each enslaved person that they freed who were abused, tortured, harassed, and threatened. In less than 9 months, Abraham Lincoln paid white slave owners a total of $1 million, and yet paid $0 to Black people who were enslaved by white people and whom built the foundations of this country.
Many people falsely believe that the 13th Amendment, signed in 1865, abolished slavery. In explicit contrast, the 13th Amendment actually preserved slavery in prisons, forcing incarcerated people to work long hours every day with harsh working conditions for practically no pay. For example, incarcerated people at Angola Prison in Louisiana work the fields in hot weather with little rest for hours every day for a pay of only 4 cents per hour. In at least 5 states, inmates aren't paid at all for their labor. Many prisons take away visitation rights, food, and have put prisoners in solitary confinement if they refuse to work for pennies. Sentences can also increase.
In addition, the resulting harms of segregation and Jim Crow can still be seen today. From the 13th Amendment being signed in 1865, it transitioned into an era of continuous violence and discrimination against Black people, an era of lynching, Jim Crow, the false notion of separate but equal, and redlining. As enslaved people were freed from working for their white owners in 1865, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan was formed by former Confederate soldiers, a white supremacist group that targeted and lynched Black people. Following Abraham Lincoln's presidency, Andrew Johnson became president during 1865 at the end of the Civil War, and he allowed states to form Black codes that discriminated against Black people, including forcing them to work for low wages while white people received much higher wages. In North Carolina, former enslaved people were not even allowed to leave the plantations they worked on, owned by white slave owners.
Black people were denied basic rights, such as the right to assemble in a group for a political social cause, the right to own a gun, to learn how to read and write, to use their free speech, and to testify against white people in court. Black people were arrested and forced to do free labor for minor infractions, which is what we still see today. Upset with the treatment of Black people in the nation, the North decided to impeach Andrew Johnson, and the Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, allowing everyone to be an American citizen no matter what race, color, etc. you were. In 1869, the 15th Amendment was signed, allowing Black people the right to vote. However, the South was not happy about this, and so the KKK reversed this momentum towards freedom. The South found ways to discriminate against Black people through poll taxes, as Black people who were recently enslaved had little wealth and therefore couldn't afford to vote. Literacy tests, because previously they had been denied the right to learn how to read and write, and Jim Crow laws, which enforced segregation between white and Black people. Jim Crow laws and redlining segregated Black and white communities, which resulted in less funding for Black neighborhoods, which resulted in lower funded schools, community centers, programs, housing, healthcare, transportation, and other opportunities, while at the same time over-policing these areas and arresting Black people at a much higher rate for petty minor infractions.
The police force is what upholds the system of oppression. A police force that over-polices Black neighborhoods and takes funds away from education, housing, healthcare, and more programs that actually solve issues at the root of their problems. The police uphold the prison industrial complex, a system that unfairly treats incarcerated people profiting off of their practically free labor in the form of slavery, and continues to target and over-police predominantly Black communities. In 1646, night patrols in Boston, also known as government-funded police, had specific jobs to look out for slaves. And if slaves were found trying to escape, they would be abused, tortured, and even killed by police before being sent back to their slave owners. After slavery, police were used to enforce dehumanizing segregation laws. This is the exact same police force that has evolved into the one that we have today. Therefore, it is no surprise that we continue to see police directly targeting Black folks and denying them their right to the point of repeatedly losing lives. Police work for the prison industrial complex, trapping Black Americans into the slavery of prison labor that we see today.
Understanding how our justice system has naturally sprung from slavery and segregation, that's vital to understanding the way systemic racism exists in our country today. Michelle Alexander, the author of The New Jim Crow, says, "In the era of colorblindness, it is no longer socially permissible to use race explicitly as a justification for discrimination, exclusion, and social contempt. So we don't. Rather than rely on race, we use our criminal justice system to label people of color as criminals and then engage in all the practices we supposedly left behind. Today, it is perfectly legal to discriminate against criminals in nearly all the ways it was once legal to discriminate against African Americans. Once you're labeled a felon, the old forms of discrimination, employment discrimination, housing discrimination, the denial of the right to vote, and the denial of educational opportunities, the denial of food stamps and other public benefits, and the exclusion from jury service are suddenly legal. As a criminal, you have scarcely more rights and arguably less respect than a Black man living in Alabama at the height of Jim Crow. We have not ended racial caste in America, we have merely redesigned it."